always thought that when I got older, my family would rally around me. That after all the meals I cooked, the scraped knees I bandaged, the birthdays I remembered, and the sleepless nights I spent worrying about everyone but myself, I would have earned a little corner of peace in my son's world. I wasn't expecting luxury. I wasn't expecting praise. I just thought, I hoped, that love and respect would be enough. That I would be enough. But life has a funny way of showing you who people truly are when you no longer serve a purpose for them. And that's exactly what I found out, the hard way, standing in my own son's living room, surrounded by family, when he looked me in the eye and said, "No rent, no stay." I still remember how his words hung in the air like poison. The silence that followed wasn't quiet, it was loud with shame, with judgment, with disbelief. My daughter-in-law avoided my eyes, busying herself with folding a dish towel that was already folded. My granddaughter shifted uncomfortably on the couch, pretending to text on her phone. And my son, my own flesh and blood, stood there, arms crossed like a landlord in front of a stranger, not the child I once rocked to sleep when he had nightmares about the monster in his closet. Turns out, I was the monster now. Unwanted. A burden. I hadn't planned on moving in permanently. It was just supposed to be temporary. My apartment building had sold, the new owners gave us 30 days to vacate, and with the rental market being what it is, I needed a few weeks to figure out my next step. I thought, foolishly, that I could rely on my son. I had always been there for him, for scraped knees, for college loans, for his wedding when they ran out of money and needed help with the florist and the photographer. I didn't do it for leverage. I did it because I loved him. But love, as I learned that day, doesn't always come back around. Not in the way you think it should. The first week at their house was polite. A bit cold, but polite. I stayed in the guest room, made sure to keep everything tidy, even cleaned their kitchen and did their laundry without being asked. I thought maybe if I just stayed out of the way and showed my appreciation through small gestures, they'd understand that I wasn't trying to leech off them, I just needed time. But the tone shifted quickly. Breakfasts became quiet. My daughter-in-law started sighing louder every time I stepped into the kitchen while she was cooking. The TV remote disappeared from the coffee table and was suddenly misplaced more often than not. And my son, he stopped saying good morning. That's when I knew I was no longer welcome, just tolerated. And even that was on thin ice. I tried to talk to him one night, after dinner, while we were putting dishes away. I said, "I'm looking for places every day, I promise. Just need a little more time." He didn't even look at me. Just said, "You know, Mom, things are tight here too. We've got bills, maybe you should consider pitching in rent." It wasn't the words, it was the way he said them, like I was some roommate behind on my half of the lease. Not a mother, not family, just someone overstaying her welcome. I nodded, said I'd think about it. But deep down, something cracked. Because I knew what it really meant. This wasn't about money. If it were, I'd have written them a check on the spot. No, this was about boundaries. About them reasserting control over their space. About making sure I knew I wasn't part of their permanent picture. And maybe even about embarrassment, because having your aging mother under your roof doesn't fit neatly into the image of success they wanted to portray. Especially not in front of their friends, who had second homes and housekeepers and posted pictures of European vacations on Facebook. The real breaking point came that Sunday. They had invited some extended family over, cousins, in-laws, people I hadn't seen in years. I offered to help cook, but my daughter-in-law waved me off with a tight smile. So I stayed upstairs most of the day, until I heard everyone settling into the living room. I came down quietly, hoping to just sit and catch up with a few people, maybe feel like I belonged somewhere, even just for a moment. But before I could even reach the couch, my son turned to me, in front of everyone, and said, "Mom, can we talk for a second?" I followed him to the hallway, heart already racing. And that's when he said it. "No rent, no stay. We can't keep carrying this. Carrying this. As if I were some sack of laundry. As if the woman who carried him for 9 months, who stayed up all night when he had strep throat, who worked overtime so he could go on that school trip to DC, had now become something to be carried. A burden. I didn't cry. Not then. I just nodded, turned around, walked back into that room full of people who pretended not to notice anything was wrong, and sat down in silence until the gathering ended. I packed my things that night, quietly, and left before sunrise. I drove to the old diner I used to go to with my late husband. Ordered coffee, stared out the window for what felt like hours. The waitress knew me. She didn't ask why I looked like I hadn't slept. She just kept refilling my cup. And in that quiet, in that stillness, I decided I was done. Done begging for scraps of respect from people who should have offered it freely. Done believing that family meant loyalty. Done pretending that I hadn't given everything I had. Because the truth was, I still had something left. And that something was mine. I had a retirement fund I'd been cautious with. I had savings. I had a mind that still worked and a spine that was starting to straighten itself again. And I had one more thing, spite. Not the angry, petty kind. The cold, focused kind that turns shame into strategy. My son thought he could reduce me to a monthly bill. The next morning, I made a phone call to a real estate agent. The house they lived in? It was on the market. They were renting. The owners had listed it privately. And I had the means. More importantly, I had the motivation. The next morning, I sat in the car across the street from the house I had just left. Their house. Or rather, the house they thought was theirs. I wasn't there to spy. I wasn't there to gloat. I think I just needed one last look at the place where I had hoped to find warmth and instead found the coldest version of love I'd ever known. The lights were off. The curtains drawn. It was just another house on another street in a neighborhood full of families pretending to have it all together. And maybe that's what stung the most, that from the outside, we looked like one of them. Polished. Functional. But behind those curtains was a truth I was still trying to swallow. I drove away without crying. That surprised me. I thought I would have fallen apart by then, let it all crash down inside me like a dam giving way. But there was nothing left to break. The grief had turned into something quieter. Something more focused. That feeling you get after you've cried every last tear and there's nothing but a sharp, still ache. It doesn't scream. It just stays there, pressing down on your chest like a stone. But oddly, it makes you lighter, too. Because when the people you love the most make it clear that you're dispensable, it frees you from the illusion that you have anything left to lose with them. I went back to that same diner. Same corner booth. Same coffee. The waitress, bless her, didn't say much, just gave me a smile that felt more like a hug. I opened my notebook, an old spiral-bound one I used to make grocery lists in, and started writing. Not anything poetic, just bullet points. What I had, what I could do, what I would not do anymore. I wrote down everything I had given to my son over the years. Not because I wanted to hold it against him, but because I needed to remind myself that I wasn't some freeloader who showed up uninvited. I had given, freely, fully, lovingly, and now I was going to give that same energy to myself. Somewhere between that second and third cup of coffee, I made the call. The real estate agent was polite, brisk, didn't ask questions. The owners were looking to sell quickly, no public listing, just a few private showings. The tenants, my son and his wife, had a lease but no purchase option. Just renters, temporary occupants in a house they assumed was part of their forever. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I just made the arrangements, gave my bank information, and drove back to the motel I had checked into the night before. That motel room was small, smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and stale air conditioning, but it felt more like home than my son's guest room ever did. I sat on the edge of the bed and looked around. No pictures on the walls. No voices echoing through the hall. Just me. And for the first time in what felt like years, I wasn't surrounded by judgment or the quiet hum of someone tolerating my presence. It was just stillness. And from that stillness came a strange comfort. Like I was finally allowed to exist without explaining myself. The days that followed were a blur of paperwork, phone calls, legal jargon. Buying a house isn't a quick thing, but when you've got the funds and the motivation, it moves faster than people expect. I didn't tell anyone, not a soul. It was mine, my decision, my secret, and for once, that felt powerful. I realized how much of my life had been about others, anticipating their needs, managing their moods, softening my edges to keep peace. Even as a mother, I had made myself small to fit into the corners of their lives. Never taking up too much space. Never asking for much. And look where that got me. I thought back to holidays past, Christmases where I cooked the entire meal but wasn't allowed to choose the music. Birthdays where I got a gift card and a sorry we're so busy this year. Mother's Days where I waited for a phone call that came at 8 p.m. because they got caught up with stuff. I ignored all those signs. Told myself they were just busy, just tired, just distracted. But what they really were, was uninterested. And that truth sat heavy on my chest. One night, as I was brushing my teeth in the tiny motel bathroom, I looked in the mirror and didn't recognize the woman staring back. Not because I looked different. I had the same lines, the same tired eyes, the same soft jaw that sagged just a little more each year. But because she looked awake, like someone who had finally realized the cage she'd been in wasn't locked from the outside. I wasn't trapped. I just didn't know I could walk away. And walking away wasn't just from the house. It was from the roles I'd played my whole life. The fixer, the peacekeeper, the reliable one. I was tired of being reliable for people who couldn't be bothered to see me as human. Who only remembered me when they needed something. Who invited me into their lives like I was a spare chair at a crowded table, useful, but not essential. I wanted to be essential again. Not to them, to myself. On the day of the closing, I wore my nicest blouse and a pair of slacks I hadn't worn since my husband's funeral. Not because I needed to dress up, but because I wanted to walk into that office feeling like I mattered. I signed the papers with a steady hand. There was no dramatic music. No applause. Just ink on paper, and a deed that now bore my name. The house was mine. Mine. And suddenly, I wasn't the woman who had been kicked out. I was the woman who had just bought the very place she was told she didn't belong in. But I didn't rush to tell them. I didn't show up at the door with keys in hand. That would have been too easy. No, I let it simmer. I let life carry on for a few more days. I wanted to see what it felt like to live in the in-between, no longer part of their world, but not yet fully in my new one. It was a strange limbo. Lonely at times, but also cleansing. I walked every morning, ate what I wanted, slept without guilt. I started journaling again. Nothing fancy, just pages filled with old memories and new intentions. I didn't want revenge. I wanted clarity. And I got it. In bits and pieces. In the silence between motel walls. In the absence of text messages. In the freedom of not being expected anywhere. I started to see how deeply I had tied my worth to being needed. And now, no one needed me. And I was still here. Still standing. Still breathing. That revelation was more powerful than any apology they could have offered. The next time I saw the house, it was mine. The porch light was on. The grass was a little overgrown. My son's car wasn't in the driveway. But my name was on the deed. I stood there for a long time, not quite sure what I was supposed to feel. Joy? Triumph? Bitterness? But what I felt was simpler than that. I felt done. Done with the stories I'd told myself to excuse their behavior. Done waiting to be chosen. Done shrinking. I wasn't going to make a scene. I wasn't going to scream, I own this place now. That wasn't me. Instead, I walked inside quietly the next morning, with a locksmith. And while he changed the locks, I stood in the foyer where my son once told me I was no longer welcome. The irony didn't make me laugh. It made me tired. Tired of the emotional gymnastics I had done for decades. Tired of explaining myself. Tired of pretending family meant safety. It didn't. Not always. But I was learning that safety doesn't have to come from other people. Sometimes, it comes from reclaiming what was yours all along. I didn't sleep that night. Not because I was scared or second-guessing myself, but because silence has a way of bringing memories back in waves. I lay on the mattress in the master bedroom, the same one they used, the same one I helped furnish when they moved in 3 years ago. I remembered writing the check for the down payment on their last apartment, the one they outgrew when the baby came. Back then, they called me generous. Said they couldn't have done it without me. I think that was the last time I felt like my presence meant something beyond utility. It's a cruel realization, to see how far you've fallen from their gratitude into their disregard. Lying there, staring at the ceiling, I started piecing things together, not just about the last few months, but about the last few years. I had mistaken politeness for closeness. Invitations out of obligation as affection. I kept showing up with food and gifts and support, not realizing that I wasn't being included, I was being managed. I was convenient when they needed a babysitter, a check, or an extra pair of hands, but inconvenient when I lingered too long, when I asked questions, when I had feelings. I had allowed myself to be folded into their lives like background noise. Always present, rarely noticed. The worst part wasn't the eviction, it was the ease with which they executed it. The fact that he didn't hesitate. That he said it with the same tone he might use to ask someone to close the fridge. That my presence didn't even warrant discomfort. That's when the grief shifted again, like a bone finally setting after a bad break. I didn't want to be around people who didn't flinch at hurting me. I didn't want to beg for crumbs of kindness from a table I had built with my own 2 hands. For the first time in decades, I began asking myself, what do I want? Not what do they need, not what's expected of me, but what does this woman, lying awake in her own house, truly want? And the answers didn't come easily. I had spent so long being someone else's support beam that I had forgotten what it felt like to dream for myself. To desire something without guilt. But slowly, little things began to form in my mind. I wanted to wake up without a sense of duty. I wanted to make breakfast for myself, just the way I liked it, and eat it while it was still hot. I wanted to read a book without feeling like I should be doing something more productive. I wanted to fill a space with things that made me feel seen, not hidden. I wanted a life that wasn't centered around being useful to other people. I started with the kitchen. Not out of sentimentality, but because it was the one place in the house that had absorbed the most of their lives. I cleaned out every drawer, every cabinet. I threw away expired spices, mismatched Tupperware, and broken utensils they'd kept for no good reason. I scrubbed until my hands ached, not because I had to, but because I needed to reclaim the space. Every crumb I wiped away felt like a piece of resentment being cleared from my spirit. I bought fresh towels. I replaced their cracked mugs with 2 beautiful new ones that I picked for myself, one navy, one forest green. Simple, solid, mine. There was a moment when I found one of my old photos tucked into the back of a drawer. A picture of me holding my son when he was 5, his cheeks round and his arms wrapped around my neck. We were both laughing. The photo was bent, faded, almost forgotten. I held it for a long time. I didn't cry, but I did feel something like mourning. Not just for the child in the picture, but for the version of me that once believed that kind of love would always stay. That motherhood guaranteed permanence. It doesn't. Love is not a pension. And no matter how much you give, it won't keep people loyal if they've decided you've expired in their world. I put the picture in a new frame. Not to display for him, but for me. Because that moment, that memory, was real. Even if what came after wasn't what I hoped. I would no longer rewrite my story to accommodate their actions. I had been a good mother. I had shown up, again and again, even when it cost me time, sleep, money, dignity. I had done enough. One afternoon, I walked through the backyard, the same space where we once had barbecues, where my granddaughter learned to ride her bike while I clapped from the patio. The grill was still there, rusted now. Forgotten. I stood in that space and felt both grief and liberation. It wasn't the yard that made the memory beautiful. It was the love I gave in that moment. That love still existed, even if it was no longer shared. I didn't need to pretend we were still a family in the way we used to be. I could grieve the loss and still choose not to carry the pain forward. That week, I started making phone calls. Not to them, not to demand anything or explain myself, but to people I had slowly lost touch with because I was always too busy being someone's helper. Old friends, a cousin I adored but hadn't seen in years. I told them I was moving into a new place, that I had time, that I wanted to reconnect. The warmth in their voices made me realize how much life I had placed on hold to be available to people who wouldn't even pick up the phone for me. I joined a book club. Nothing fancy, just a few women who met on Thursdays at the library down the road. The first meeting, I barely spoke. I wasn't ready, but I listened, and in their stories, I heard echoes of mine. Disappointments, sacrifices, quiet resentments, but also resilience, and laughter. I went home that night with a full heart and the tiniest spark of something I hadn't felt in a long time, belonging. I didn't need to confront my son. I didn't need to send a letter or explain how deeply he had hurt me. I wasn't looking for closure anymore. Closure implies that both people are willing to sit in the discomfort and take responsibility. He wasn't, and I wasn't going to keep knocking on a door that would only open to throw me out again. Instead, I focused on building something new, not flashy or dramatic, but steady. I painted one of the bedrooms a soft shade of blue. Hung up art I picked just because I liked it. Started cooking again, this time for myself, not to please anyone else. And every time I stood at the sink or sat in the sunlit corner of the living room, I reminded myself, I am not disposable. I am not invisible. I am not someone's afterthought. I started writing again, not for anyone to read. Just for myself. Journaling at first, then little essays, pieces of memory stitched together with quiet reflection. I wasn't trying to become anyone. I just wanted to know myself again. To see what was left of me once the roles were stripped away. And what I found wasn't empty, it was spacious. Full of possibility. Full of grace. I hadn't spoken to my son since the day I left. He didn't call. Neither did his wife. There was no apology. No attempt to reconnect. And that used to sting. But over time, the silence became its own kind of answer. Not a cruel one, just a clear one. They had made their choice. And now, so had I. The hardest part wasn't letting go of the people who hurt me. It was letting go of the hope that they'd one day realize it. That they'd show up, apologize, or even just say, "We see you now." It's a quiet kind of grief, the one that doesn't come with funerals or casseroles or sympathy cards. It's the grief of understanding that what you thought was love might have only ever been convenience. And it creeps up on you in the smallest moments, like seeing a mother and daughter laughing in the grocery store, or hearing someone talk about Sunday dinners with their grandkids. Not because I envy them, but because I realize how little of that was ever truly mine. And yet, with every quiet day that passed, I started to see how much space there was inside me now. Space that used to be taken up by worry. By trying to earn affection I should have had by default. By replaying conversations in my head, wondering if I could have said something better, done something different. But that space was slowly becoming something else. Room for breath, for thought, for healing. I found a kind of rhythm in my new life that didn't depend on anyone else's needs. I'd wake up when the light came through the windows. I'd make tea and sit on the back steps with a blanket over my shoulders. I wasn't rushing to be anywhere or trying to fix anyone's mess. The stillness wasn't lonely anymore. It was grounding. I could finally hear myself think. And more importantly, I liked what I was hearing. For so long, I believed my value came from how much I could endure. How many times I could say yes. How often I could keep the peace, even at the cost of my own dignity. But the truth is, all that endurance only taught people that I would keep showing up no matter how they treated me. That I didn't need thanks. That I didn't need kindness. That I was the constant, unchanging, uncomplaining, always available. But I wasn't that woman anymore. I couldn't be. She didn't survive what I went through. What did survive was something quieter, but stronger. A kind of resolve that wasn't angry, but firm. I didn't hate my son. I didn't wish him harm. But I also didn't wish to be in his life anymore, not like before. Not as a backup plan or a last resort. He had shown me who he was. And I had finally believed him. There was a day, about a month after I'd moved in, when I drove past the grocery store I used to shop at with him when he was little. We'd go every Saturday. He'd push the cart and beg me for cereal with cartoons on the box, and I'd pretend to say no before tossing it in. Back then, he clung to my arm like I was the safest thing in the world. And maybe I was. For a time. But children grow. And sometimes, the safety you offer becomes something they resent. A mirror they no longer want to look into. I didn't go into that store. I sat in the parking lot for a moment, then drove away. I didn't need to revisit those memories anymore. They weren't comforting. They were heavy. And I had carried them long enough. Instead, I stopped by the small farmer's market that popped up near the park on Sundays. It wasn't big, but it was warm. People said hello. A woman around my age complimented my scarf. Another handed me a jar of homemade jam and told me it went great with toast and silence. I smiled, because I knew exactly what she meant. The more I settled into this version of my life, the more I realized how much of it had been waiting for me all along. Not in some grand, transformative moment, but in the smallest shifts. The way I no longer apologized when I didn't want to answer the phone. The way I let the voicemail play and felt no guilt. The way I stopped justifying how I spent my time or my money. For years, I gave away so much of myself in the name of being good, being helpful, being needed. And now, I was learning how to give to myself. Not out of selfishness, but out of self-respect. It wasn't easy. There were days when the old patterns tried to pull me back. When I saw something at the store and thought, oh, they'd like this, before remembering that they hadn't thought of me in weeks. There were nights when I wondered if the silence between us would ever break. But then I'd sit on my porch, feel the breeze on my skin, and realize I didn't miss them. I missed the version of me who still believed I mattered to them. And she was gone now. In her place was someone quieter, steadier, more honest. I started volunteering at the community center. Nothing big, just a few hours helping sort books for the library sale or serving coffee at the weekly meetup for local seniors. And in those rooms, I found a kind of connection I hadn't felt in years. Not because we had the same blood or the same history, but because we showed up. Fully, genuinely, with no performance. There's something sacred about being seen without being used. One afternoon, a woman I'd just met said, "You've got a peaceful energy." It took everything in me not to cry on the spot. Because for most of my life, peace had felt like a luxury I couldn't afford. I was always too busy keeping the world spinning for everyone else. But now, here I was, still, whole, and finally at home in my own skin. I think the final shift came quietly. No dramatic moment, no letter from my son, no confrontation. Just a morning when I woke up, made my tea, and realized I hadn't thought about them in days. Not with longing, not with pain, just, hadn't thought of them at all. And that, more than anything, told me I was healing. Because true freedom isn't about revenge. It's not about proving anyone wrong. It's about no longer needing them to be wrong for you to be right. I didn't reclaim that house to make a point. I reclaimed it because I was tired of being exiled from the very spaces I helped build. I wasn't a guest in my own story anymore. I was the author. And while I couldn't rewrite the past, I could choose the chapters that followed. They might not be filled with the people I once loved, but they would be full of something I had gone far too long without: truth. It didn't happen overnight, that feeling of peace. It came in layers, slow and quiet, like the way snow builds on branches, almost imperceptible until you realize the whole world around you has softened. One morning, I caught my reflection in the hallway mirror and didn't flinch. I didn't search my own eyes for signs of exhaustion or sadness or failure. I just looked. And what I saw wasn't a woman who had been cast aside. It was a woman who had finally stopped asking to be let in. I had spent so much of my life shrinking myself, trying to fit into the spaces others allowed me. I thought that was what good mothers did. Good daughters. Good wives. We make room. We step back. We stay quiet when it's inconvenient to be seen. But all that shrinking left me hollow. It's no wonder they thought there was nothing left to respect. I had given away every edge of myself trying to stay easy to love. And I suppose the real turning point was the realization that I didn't have to be lovable to anyone but me. That loving myself wasn't selfish, it was survival. That my presence wasn't a problem to be managed, but a life to be lived fully, without shame, without permission. I stopped walking on eggshells in my own house. I stopped apologizing to the air when I dropped something or laughed too loudly. I stopped bracing for rejection before anyone even had the chance to speak. I filled the home with sounds I liked. Soft jazz in the kitchen, the occasional audiobook while I folded laundry. I baked again, not because someone asked me to, but because I liked how cinnamon made the whole place smell warm. I planted herbs by the window. I painted the mailbox. Small things, ordinary things, but they were mine. Chosen, not inherited. Intentional, not reactionary. One afternoon, as I sat on the front porch with a cup of tea, the wind picked up and carried the sound of a child laughing from somewhere down the street. It reminded me of the years when my son's laughter filled our home. And for a second, I felt the ache again. But it didn't take me under this time. It passed, like a wave that knows not to crash anymore. I had loved deeply. That part of me was never broken. But love without respect isn't love at all. It's performance. And I was done performing. There was a freedom in not needing the last word. I didn't have to explain why I stopped reaching out. I didn't have to craft the perfect letter, pouring out every hurt in the hope it would spark a revelation. I used to think closure was something you earned from the one who hurt you. But I've learned it's something you give yourself, when you finally stop bleeding for people who never learned how to hold you gently. Sometimes people show you exactly who they are. And if you're brave enough to stop making excuses for them, you can walk away before the damage becomes your identity. I didn't tell many people about what happened. Not because I was ashamed, but because the story was mine now. It didn't need an audience. It didn't need validation. And besides, I wasn't interested in sympathy. I had spent enough years collecting other people's sympathy instead of building my own strength. I wasn't a victim. I was someone who finally said enough. Who chose herself, not out of anger, but out of clarity. The house, once full of tension and cold glances, now held light in every corner. I opened the blinds every morning. I let the sun in. I bought a hammock for the backyard, the kind I used to dream about but always said was too impractical. I laid in it every Sunday afternoon and read novels with no deeper purpose than joy. I drank cold lemonade. I let the breeze tangle my hair. I smiled at strangers on walks and meant it. I became the version of myself I used to think was a luxury. And I did it not because someone gave me permission, but because I finally gave it to myself. There were no dramatic endings. No one came knocking on the door in tears. No last-minute redemption arcs. Just silence. But it wasn't empty anymore. It was space. It was possibility. It was mine. I'm not saying I don't still have moments. Of course I do. Grief doesn't leave entirely, it just changes shape. Sometimes I miss the idea of family. The way I hoped it would feel. But I've stopped trying to resurrect a version of the past that never existed in the first place. I've learned that longing for what never was is its own kind of heartbreak. And I've lived through enough of those. Now, when I set the table, it's for me. When I make plans, they're mine. When I say no, I mean it. And when I say yes, it's not out of fear of being forgotten, it's out of desire to be fully present. I don't need to be needed anymore. I need to be whole. And I am. Maybe that's what growing older really means. Not just wrinkles and slower mornings. But becoming finally, irrevocably, yourself. No longer defined by who left or who stayed. But by who you choose to be when you're finally free from proving anything to anyone. I used to think being a mother meant sacrificing myself over and over. But now I understand, it means showing your children how to live with dignity. And sometimes, that means walking away. Not to hurt them, but to save yourself. The day I took ownership of this house, I thought the victory would come from proving a point. But now I know, the real triumph was this quiet, steady peace. The kind that doesn't need to be announced. The kind you earn, day by choosing not to betray yourself again. This isn't revenge. This is rebirth. And I wouldn't trade it for anything. One of the strangest things about healing is how quiet it is. I always imagined it would be this big moment, some dramatic turning point where everything finally made sense. But instead, it came in the form of doing laundry without crying. Of sleeping through the night without waking up with a lump in my throat. Of going an entire week without wondering if they missed me. Healing didn't show up like a rescue. It slipped in slowly, disguised as ordinary things I used to rush through without thinking. I started taking long walks in the mornings. Not because I was restless, but because my body wanted to move. I'd pass by houses with tidy lawns and kids playing on scooters, and I'd feel that old tug of memory. For years, my life revolved around others, school drop-offs, late-night fevers, forgotten lunches. I lived in the rhythm of someone else's urgency. But now, there was no one waiting. No schedule pulling at me. Just my breath, my footsteps, and the trees whispering above. And in that stillness, I began to hear myself more clearly than I ever had. I stopped trying to narrate my life in a way that made it palatable for others. I stopped softening the truth so it wouldn't make them uncomfortable. The truth was, I was abandoned. Emotionally, then practically. And for a long time, I thought that said something about me. About my worth, my failures. But now I know, it said everything about them. About their choices, their discomfort with vulnerability, their inability to love without condition. There's a strange sort of dignity that comes with no longer needing to be right. I used to run circles in my head, listing all the ways I was wronged, all the receipts I could show to prove I'd given everything. But dignity isn't found in evidence. It's found in stillness, in not having to prove yourself anymore. in knowing what you gave, and walking away anyway. I didn't hate them. That surprised me. I thought maybe, one day, I'd feel rage. But what came instead was a quiet sort of mourning. Not for what we had, but for what never really existed in the first place. For the family I tried so hard to believe in. For the hope I kept feeding long after it had starved me. It's a special kind of grief, letting go of what you wanted someone to be. But that grief makes room for something else. For clarity. For agency. For new beginnings that don't require anyone's blessing. I went to the beach for the first time in years. Just drove myself there, early on a weekday morning when it was still cool and quiet. I didn't bring a book or a friend. Just a blanket, a thermos of tea, and a heart that had finally stopped racing. I watched the tide move in and out, again and again, and I realized how much of life is just that, ebb and flow. Nothing holds forever. Not pain, not joy, not even love, sometimes. But we keep breathing, we keep going, and that's enough. For the first time in decades, I felt proud of myself, not for surviving, but for walking away. For refusing to keep breaking my heart for people who saw my love as currency, not connection. I wasn't bitter. I was awake. And with that awakening came a different kind of joy, not loud, not showy, just solid. A joy that didn't depend on anyone remembering my birthday or asking how I was. A joy that came from planting herbs and watching them grow. From folding fresh laundry with the windows open. From lighting a candle in the evening and sitting with my thoughts without fear of what they'd say. I think we spend so much of our lives trying to earn what should have been given freely. I tried to earn kindness, to buy my place in their lives with good deeds and quiet sacrifices. But the people who truly love you don't need proof. They don't keep score. They just show up. And if they don't, you learn to stop standing on the porch waiting. I haven't spoken to my son since the day I left. There's a part of me that wonders if he tells people his version of the story, one where I was the problem, where I couldn't adapt or help out. I used to be terrified of that, of being misunderstood, but now, I realize, I don't owe anyone the truth but myself. Let them say what they need to sleep at night. I sleep just fine. Sometimes I think about what I'll say if he ever calls. Not because I hope for it, but because it no longer scares me. I know what I would say, if it came to that. I would tell him I love him. That I always will, but that I also love myself. And that, finally, after all these years, I chose me. That's the ending I never saw coming. Not reconciliation, not revenge, but restoration. I restored my peace. I restored my voice. I restored the home I once gave away, piece by piece, in exchange for proximity to people who never truly saw me. And now, I live in that home, on my own terms, in my own rhythm, without apology. I don't wait for visitors. I don't check my phone for messages that don't come. I fill my days with what nourishes me. Small things, real things, a walk, a breeze, a meal I cook just for the joy of it. This isn't loneliness. This is liberation. And after all these years, I'm finally free. Sometimes I sit by the window in the early evening, just as the sun starts to dip behind the trees. There's a softness in that light, the kind that makes even the roughest edges look golden. And I think, this is what peace looks like. Not perfection, not a fairy tale, just a quiet, steady knowing that I am no longer trying to prove I deserve space in anyone's life. There's still silence between me and my son. No calls, no messages, no unexpected visits. And strangely, I no longer wait for them. I don't imagine what I'd say. I don't rehearse forgiveness or demand explanations in my mind. That part of the story has ended, not with a slammed door, but with a decision I made alone and fully. I left the version of myself that begged to be loved where it belonged, in the past. I don't miss her. I honor her. She kept going long after she should have stopped. And because of her, I'm still here. I look around my house now and see pieces of that woman, but they're not broken anymore. They're repurposed, reshaped, the same way I took the space that once held rejection and filled it with the scent of fresh basil from my windowsill garden. The same way I took the silence and turned it into music and laughter and books stacked on side tables. I gave this place new meaning, not for them, not for appearances, but for me. There's a photo on the mantle, just me, sitting on that same front porch, holding a mug of tea, wearing a sweater I knit last fall. My friend took it during one of her visits. When she showed it to me, I was stunned. I didn't recognize myself at first. I looked calm, unburdened. There was no tension in my shoulders, no apology in my posture. Just me, fully in my own life, not watching it from the sidelines. I keep that photo there as a reminder, not of what I lost, but of what I found when I finally stopped chasing what wasn't mine. It's easy to romanticize the past, to believe if we'd just said the right thing, done the right thing, loved a little harder, things would be different. But I know better now. Some people will never see you, no matter how brightly you burn. And that's not your failure. It's just the limits of their vision. So I stopped dimming myself. I go out when I want. I rest when I need. I make plans that don't require permission. I have friends who show up with coffee and stories and no expectations. We laugh. Sometimes we cry. But mostly, we just exist together, with all our bruises and wisdom and weathered softness. And in that, I've found a different kind of family. The kind built on presence, not pressure. On choice, not obligation. The truth is, I still love my son. I probably always will. But I love myself more. And that's not bitterness. That's healing. That's growth. That's knowing I am allowed to prioritize my own well-being, even when it means letting go of people I once would have walked through fire for. Maybe that's what this stage of life is really about. Not fixing everything, but finally learning to live with the mess, and choosing not to let it define you. I don't need a perfect ending. I just need an honest one. And this is it. Not loud, not dramatic, just true. This is my house. This is my peace. This is my life. And I'm finally living it on my terms.